Hi everyone, welcome to my TED Talk. Today I'm planning to cover organelles and give you an analogy to help you remember all the different types of organelles and what they do for the cell. But before we get into that, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we understand what a cell is and how it defines life, what's made of cells, and the different classifications of cells. So let's get started. So cells. Who are made of cells? Well, all living things are. That means that you are, I am, all the plants are, as well as our favorite animals. And cells are super important for life because they are the basic unit of life. So that means that anything that is living is made of cells, and cells can be the smallest unit of something that is alive. But they are super small. A lot of cells come together to make these bigger organisms we see, but to see an individual cell, we would have to use a microscope. But just because they're small, that doesn't mean that they're not very important. They help to organize living things, and they provide a lot of structure and function to the larger organisms. So how many cells can make up an organism? Well, some are just made up of one cell, and these are unicellular organisms. These are examples such as bacteria and yeast cells. But humans, on the other hand, are made up of 37.2 trillion cells, which is a lot, and that's what this number looks like. I had to Google it to know how many zeros to put. I tried to find a really awesome comparison to put that into scale, and it was so big that no one could even tell me how many times a cell could wrap around the earth or anything like that. But it's a very large number, and because we're made up of more than one cell, we are multicellular. So this includes any organisms that are made up of two or more cells. So they could just be made of two cells, or they could be made of 37.2 trillion cells like we are, or they could be made of more. Some cells are considered prokaryotic, and these cells do not have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles, which is something we'll get into more detail about later when we start to talk about organelles, but membrane-bound means that there is a membrane on the outside of the cell, and it's like a protective layer. Bacteria are also an example of prokaryotic cells, as well as archaea. Eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus, and they do have membrane-bound organelles. So most of the organisms that you're thinking of right now are probably eukaryotic. So these are things such as plants and animals. So what's the difference between the two? Well, the only thing that they have in common are that they both have DNA, ribosomes, and a cell membrane. Inside the prokaryotic cell on the right, you can see that there's a lack of other bigger, more specific parts of the cell, like how the eukaryotic diagram shows those membrane-bound organelles and that nucleus. But it's super important to remember that because it is a prokaryotic cell, it still must have DNA and it still must have a ribosome, which is something that we'll cover again later, but it's something that makes proteins, and it's super important for cell function. So, we've been saying this word and not really defining it. So let's get into what an organelle is. An organelle is a specialized structure within the cells that provides an important function or its job within the cell to keep it alive and healthy. So this diagram here below shows some of the organelles that we're going to cover today in this TED Talk. There are also a few extras, but that's okay. So let's pretend that the cell is like a city, and we're going to call it microscopic city since they're so small. And we really want to get into this city, but we pull up and there's a gate. Well, how do we know if we're going to get through? We have to be something specific that the town wants to let in. So there's a similar organelle in cells that does a similar job, which is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is the protective layer around the cell, and it controls what enters and exits. Molecules that are trying to get in or out of the cell have to have a specific signal or a specific shape to let themselves in, to get in or out. So luckily, we got into the town, and the first thing we see is this beautiful city hall building. And in here, this is where the government officials' offices are, and they work to make laws to help regulate the city. And lucky enough for us, the cell has something similar. The cell has the nucleus, which contains the organism's DNA, and it also controls the activity of the cell. So in this diagram, you'll see the nucleus is that whole thing, and then it has that little ball in the middle, and that's where some of the DNA would be. Moving on, in this town, we keep walking and we see these power plants because the town needs electricity and it needs energy to run. And luckily for us, again, the cell also has something that provides energy. This is called the mitochondria. It's the organelle that will convert the energy that we eat from the food, and that's stored in that food, to a more usable form of energy for the cell to use. And the cell uses a molecule called ATP for its energy source. And it's just a small molecule that it can eventually break down and get energy from to power the cell and all the other functions that the cell needs to do. And here's a diagram. Within the cell as well, within the town as well, the citizens need different supplies. And so they have these factories that make all the things that the citizens may need in the town. And in the cell, there's a factory-like organelle where proteins are made, and that's called the ribosome. The ribosome is super important because it does make those proteins, and the cell really needs proteins to help it survive and grow and help fix itself or heal itself if something gets damaged. So now that the factories have made tons of stuff for the citizens, how would we transport that stuff? Well, first off, we would need roads. And roads are like the endoplasmic reticulum of the cell, because this organelle is something that processes the material and helps move it throughout the cell. So just like the roads in the town, the ER is the route that different materials can take to move throughout the cell. And we would also need UPS or the post office or something like that. So if a citizen orders something from those factories, the UPS driver will pick it up and will take the package and will deliver it. And in the cell, we have an organelle called the Golgi body or Golgi apparatus. And that organelle modifies, sorts, and packages different proteins and sends them to help send them to different parts of the cell, because proteins are needed all over the cell. So they have to be able to move. And the Golgi body really helps with that, to distribute them to where the cell may need them. Sometimes we don't specifically order something from the factory. Sometimes we don't need it right away, so it goes to a store. And when we need it, we can go to that store and get it. Well, the cell has something similar. They have vacuoles, which can hold water, salt, proteins, and carbohydrates until they're needed by the cell. So just like us, sometimes we don't need something right away, but we'll need it eventually. And so the factories have already made something and they send it to the store, just like how if the cell has already made something, they'll put it in a vacuole and then the cell can refer to that vacuole later when they actually need those materials. But with all this stuff being made, there's definitely going to be some waste. And so our city has a landfill, which is lucky for us because we just don't want trash laying around, and neither does the cell. So in our city, the trash goes to the landfill to be broken down. And in the cell, the lysosome is what breaks down cell waste. And so these are little pockets within the cell where it can collect waste and then break it down so that the cell can remain healthy and functioning. And what's the last thing we need? Well, the air in the town fills the space between all the components. And in the cell, it has cytoplasm, which is a gel-like material that fills the space between the organelles and holds them in the cell. All right, so we finished our tour of our normal microscopic town. But there can be differences in towns, just like there are some differences between plant and animal cells. So everything we've covered is included in both plant and animal cells, but plants have some different needs and need different organelles. First, plants need somewhere to make energy, so they have the chloroplast. It captures energy from sunlight and converts it into a chemical energy that can then be used later, like carbohydrates. And once this energy is made, that's what the cell will use in the mitochondria to break it down and have a usable form of energy. So I'm hoping you're starting to see how some of these organelles are very connected. And in our town, or a different town, this would be like a farm, which is making food for citizens to eat. The cell wall also provides the extra support and protection that plant cells need. It's more rigid and it's outside of the cell membrane, and so it provides a better support system than just a cell membrane. This would be like a wall around the town, but lucky for us, there's still those gates, so we can still get in, just like how the cells still have a cell membrane that selectively lets molecules enter or exit the cell. Organelles are extremely, extremely important for the organization and the function of cells. So I'm hoping that after this TED Talk, you're seeing how important organelles are and how they help contribute to cell function as well as organization in larger organisms.